to Crawlspace. Tonight we have a really interesting interview. What do you think, Lance?
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's Deborah Halber. She wrote the book The Skeleton Crew, which is essentially about the birth of the amateur sleuth. And this is also the first episode of what we are going to call the Cellar Series. Now, these interviews have nothing to do with the current case that we're working on. For example, we are working on the Brianna Maitland case. In the future, we'll be working on other cases. These are going to be shorter interviews that we conduct with people who are in the industry of unsolved crimes, online sleuthing, amateur sleuthing,
Podcasters, authors. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So they're going to be shorter interviews where they can create a thread that ties together this entire community of amateur sleuthing.
Yeah, and it's topics and people that we find interesting, so we would like to think that you will find them interesting as well.
It gives us a little bit of freedom to show our personality when it comes to interviewing people.
And a little bit of a breather, too, from the darker stuff.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's roll the interview with Deborah Halber, and we highly recommend that you check out her book, The Skeleton Crew. You can buy it on Amazon or wherever books are sold, and we will link to it in the show notes. So check out the book. It is really great.
It's really great, and it's something if you're a millennial amateur sleuth who does the research online. I mean, this isn't even like ancient history. This is, the turn of the 2000s. This is 1990s to 2000s, and it's going to be pretty remarkable and pretty fascinating for you to look at and see how hard it was. Not even that long ago. You have it very easy.
Let's roll the interview, and thank you very much for listening to Crawlspace. Check out blueapron.com/crawlspace for your first 3 meals free with free shipping. We welcome author Deborah Halber to the podcast. Deborah is the author of a nonfiction book called The Skeleton Crew, about online sleuths trying to solve cold cases and help match missing persons to unidentified human remains.
Welcome to the show, Deborah. You and I had originally emailed a little while ago when Tim and I first started doing our project with Maura Murray's disappearance. Before we get into your book and the culture of amateur sleuthing, let the listeners know a little bit about what you do, because it says here that you're a science writer, and I was trying to figure out, I didn't want to Google it and cheat. I wanted you to let me know what a science writer does.
Well, basically, I just write mostly about science. I consider that my specialty. But this particular foray into this investigation that led to the Skeleton Crew is a bit of an anomaly for me. When I came across a Massachusetts case that I was particularly fascinated about, a case called The Lady of the Dunes, about a woman who had been, this woman had been brutally murdered in Provincetown in the 70s, and she had never been identified. So yes, I do mostly consider myself a science writer, and there is some science of forensics in my book, but this particular investigation is really about cold cases and unidentified human remains.
And it's also really interesting to look at because Tim and I are right in the thick of that culture of amateur sleuths and online sleuthing. And it was really interesting to read this and discover that there is almost a founder of this culture, of this community, Todd Matthews.
Yes, this was a time, let me back up a little bit. Todd Matthews is, he lives in Livingston, Tennessee, and he, at the time that he was in high school, he came across a case, much like I had stumbled on the Lady of the Dunes case. He had stumbled across a case known as Tent Girl. And this was a young woman, some said maybe a teenager, who had been found dead by the side of a road in Kentucky in the 60s. And Todd was not even alive when she was found, but when he stumbled upon this case, he became pretty obsessed with it himself. So he spent 10 years trying to figure out the identity of Tent Girl. And the thing that really brought this community into being was the advent of the internet. At the advent of the internet, it started to become possible to create rudimentary bulletin boards, just ways to post information that a lot of people could see at the same time. So when people started realizing they could do this with missing persons cases and unidentified remains, this was a real game changer for this endeavor, for web sleuths, if you will. And Todd was one of the first to post information online, to search through online information. And that's how he eventually did manage to actually solve the case of Tent Girl.
It's pretty fascinating that he went through the majority of his searching for the identity of Tent Girl during a time when the internet didn't exist and right at the point of its infancy. So between 1968, when Tent Girl was discovered, and 1998, you have a period of no internet, right? I mean, for the most part. So my question is, how do you see the evolution of amateur sleuthing improving or not improving? Maybe it's actually hurting investigations between when Tent Girl was first discovered in 1968 to 98, as opposed to 98 to now. Hopefully that question isn't too confusing, because they were looking into the identity of Tent Girl by making phone calls and going to the library and putting boots on the ground and interviewing people. Now it's a Google search, and a lot of people draw their own conclusions based on internet chatter.
So yes, so the early days was just a completely different ballgame. As you say, it was a matter of looking through newspaper archives, old police files, if those were available, anything they could find that was related to a case. And the point was, the goal was to get it out there, because, from state to state, some dusty archives, that's not something people are just going to stumble across. So initially, Todd's real efforts were, as you say, just with very almost antiquated sources of microfiche and files and old newspaper articles. But getting that information up on the internet was really key. So since then, yes, what has happened is that now it has become essentially purely an online venture. And people are searching for information, which is still available online. I mean, entire archives of newspapers are now online, so you certainly can still search for the equivalent of information in a dusty filing cabinet. Still exists, and it still can be found, and it now can be found online. So yes, the search has been altered by the advances of the internet. But what hasn't changed is that this is still essentially a needle in a haystack kind of search, especially when you're talking about unidentified remains and missing people. There may be a lot of records, there may be way more records than there used to be, but essentially you're still trying to make an almost impossible match to make, because on one hand, for unidentified remains, you might have a few details such as estimated height or weight or age. And then from missing people, you would have a true height and weight and age, hopefully, if the information is accurate. But trying to put those together is just a nightmarish hunt for like a needle in a haystack. But so what people are really contributing these days is the crowdsourcing and just having a lot of eyes on the same material in the hope that they will propose a match that actually turns out to be an accurate one.
What do you think people get out of this kind of thing, doing this? What do you think they, psychologically speaking or emotionally speaking, why do people do this?
Well, that is pretty much what I was wondering when I set out to write this book and research this book. So I could not imagine what it would take to look through some of the information that is available online, but is so disturbing and creepy. There are these databases. Some of them are created by law enforcement or certain jurisdictions, or let's say a federal agency, some sort of government agency. Some of them are created by other web sleuths, and they are just, they have little warning signs, but they can be extraordinarily disturbing. Some of them have actual morgue photos. Some of them have digital reconstructions of what the person would have looked like when they had been alive. Some of them have very amateurish pencil sketches, but essentially what it is you're looking at is an online morgue. And it can get very wearing very fast because it's just so sad to think of all these people out there whose families have no closure, whose families don't know where they are or if they're alive or dead. Whatever became of them. And when you think of yourself or your loved ones being in that situation, it's just doubly sad. So people who are looking to provide this kind of closure to families are looking through these images for hours and hours and hours, sometimes on a daily basis. And it really strikes me as just very soul crushing. So I did set out to try to figure out what people were doing when they were doing this. And it turns out people have a variety of motives and reasons for doing this kind of work. And it is work, it's hard work. And it's primarily thankless, unpaid work. But some people do it for that very reason, that they feel for the families and they do want to provide closure to a family who's missing a loved one. Other people do it because they are good at this kind of thing. They're good at puzzles and challenges, and maybe they're somewhat underemployed in their day jobs. So they might be super smart and very able to pick up on clues and put these kinds of clues together, but they don't necessarily have the option of doing that on a day-to-day basis for their regular work. So this becomes a hobby that's a challenge and can provide satisfaction, again, if they do actually manage to make those elusive matches. So those are just some of the motivations for people who are out there working in these fields.
There's a quote in your book by Todd Matthews where he says, making an identification, that's power. You just changed something. You changed an unknown person into a homicide investigation. And he's a really interesting character. He's probably, would you say he's the central character in the book?
Yes, he's definitely one of them. Todd's story is so crazy in so many ways. He started out just living in a really simple, tiny town. He still lives in the same town he grew up in, but when he first lived there, he was first married. He and his wife were teenage bride and groom, and they lived in a trailer home, basically, adjacent to his parents' very modest house. And they struggled financially. They both worked full time. They did everything they could to make ends meet. Yet Todd was working on this second job, so to speak. I mean, he worked midnight, night shifts in a factory. And in the rest of his time, he was working this case. He was unofficial, unpaid, volunteer, recognized by no one, basically brushed off by law enforcement. And yet he persevered with this case. And it did take the advent of the internet to help him solve it. But in the end, he did.
It's a great moment when you describe him figuring out the identity of Tent Girl. The other interesting character is Marcella Fierro. She struck me as somebody who I think Tim and I would probably get along with.
She is, Dr. Fierro is a force of nature. She is she was the inspiration for the main character in Patricia Cornwell's fictional books about a forensic anthropologist. And in real life, Marcella Fierro is just, as I say, she is a powerhouse. And she dedicated herself to trying to help others like her, find all the clues they possibly could when they came across an unidentified body. It struck her that when she had one of these bodies on her autopsy table, it was difficult to figure out anything that could possibly lead to an ID. And many anthropologists, many forensic specialists may not have taken the time to do it because it didn't seem like anyone was really looking for these people. They had no identity, and the only clues to their identity was on, just their bodies themselves. Did they have tattoos? Had they ever had a broken bone? Had they had surgery? In one case, I don't think this was Dr. Fierro's case, but in one case, a woman, an unidentified victim, was identified by the serial numbers in her breast implants. So these people were doing anything they could to try to pull together clues that could eventually lead to an ID. And she was one of the first pioneers in that field to try to pave the way for others to be able to get those clues.
Lance, have you ever tried to cook dinner in the dark with no lights, maybe just a flashlight?
Other than camping?
Yeah.
No, should I?
No, and I've never done it camping, but I did do it the other night while trying to cook Blue Apron because my kid was falling asleep and I was already mid cook and I couldn't stop. And so I used my phone flashlight and I was still able to do it.
Don't you have an oven light?
Maybe. I don't know. I'm a dumbass in the kitchen. I seriously don't even know if I have an oven light.
I'm pretty sure you do. I'm pretty sure you have a light that...
Amazing food. It's the freshest food you can imagine. I had spicy shrimp coconut curry with cabbage and rice the other night.
I just made that.
Was that unbelievable or what?
That is my lunch today, by the way. It's incredible, and the best part of that is it's so easy to store the leftovers. Just mix your shrimp with the cabbage, with the rice, put it in a little container, and it is way better the next day. These are ridiculous recipes.
I didn't get to it the next day because I ate it all that night, but it was really outstanding. Definitely a top, probably 3 meal that I've ever tried from Blue Apron. The flavor was just outstanding.
Agreed.
Check out Blue Apron. I mean, it's the #1 fresh ingredient and recipe delivery service in the country.
The produce is sourced from farms that practice regenerative farming. So if you don't know what that is, look it up. Yes, it is a great word.
It's just so fun to say.
Right. And you know it's important, right? Regenerative farming.
Blue Apron is so easy to cook. Like I said, I am a dumbass in the kitchen. I didn't even know I had a stove light, which you're probably right. I had.
You definitely have a stove light.
I was using the light on my phone instead.
Yeah,
but that's how easy it is when a dumbass like me, who is cooking in the dark, didn't screw anything up. Well, check out this week's menu and get your first 3 meals free with free shipping by going to blueapron.com/crawlspace. You'll love how good it feels and tastes to create incredible home-cooked meals with Blue Apron, so don't wait.
That's blueapron.com/crawlspace. Blue Apron, a better way to cook.
And before we roll the rest of the interview, we just wanted to invite you to join us to take this podcast survey from Edison. Because of our friends at Blue Apron, we bring you this show for free. So this is a way to keep the show free.
It takes no more than 5 minutes. I love surveys. I never thought that I would like surveys, but when you tell me that a survey, yeah, right? Listen to it and take the survey at the same time. It takes 5 minutes.
Go to podcast.study to complete the survey. So right now you're listening to Crawlspace. Make sure you mention it in the survey.
So that's it. Thank you very much for trying it and enjoy the rest of the podcast.
Did you notice any common elements, like personality-wise or profession-wise, between some of these online sleuths that you researched or met?
The online sleuths, to me, and this, when I was researching this book, this was a few years ago, but I traveled around the country to talk to as many of the ones as I could who had amazing success stories. So the web sleuths that I sought out were ones who had a track record, had a proven track record of actually making matches, providing IDs that eventually panned out. And this was huge because there are many online sleuths, many web sleuths. Many of them have provided potential IDs, but only a small fraction of them actually turn out to be accurate. So, but I was struck by how the web sleuths that I spoke to had seemed to just come from all walks of life. Some of them were professional people. They, had high-powered day jobs and came home and did this at night. Others were stay-at-home mothers who snuck in a few hours on the computer whenever they could. Others were retirees who were doing this as a sort of second profession, second or third career. There were retired law enforcement. In one state, there was a retired sheriff who was doing this. So it was actually a pretty wide range of types of people who were involved. But they all seemed to get involved in a similar manner. They usually had heard about a case, maybe a missing persons case. And when they went on the internet to try to see what they could find out, they came across some of these websites. The Doe Network, as in Jane and John Doe, was one of the earliest websites of its kind. And it's still up there. And they would come across a website like that and be struck by all the unidentified bodies out there. And they would get sucked into this world and one thing would lead them to another, and they would start to try to investigate the cases on their own.
We do a podcast on a pretty popular missing person named Maura Murray. Is it safe to say that there are enough people out there doing this kind of thing that Maura Murray has been searched over and over through these databases?
I believe so, especially a case like hers that has gotten a fair bit of media coverage over the years. I would think that would lead to an enormous outpouring of interest among the public and people who would go on to the web to try to A, read more about her particular case, and then B, like some of the web sleuths, happen upon missing persons websites and then get involved through that route. But yes, there's usually a huge outpouring of interest in a case like that. The sad thing is that there are, especially among the unidentified, there are so many of these. There are supposedly 40,000 at least unidentified bodies across the U.S. And so many of these people have never had even a few words of media coverage. They are just completely, literally nameless, faceless, and long lost to the back burner of law enforcement. So it's some of the less known cases where web sleuths can make an enormous difference.
And it wasn't until 2001, correct, that there wasn't even a budget for identifying these unknown victims, correct?
Yes, it was actually 9/11 that spawned a bit of public money that got freed up in this realm, because when 9/11 happened, there was an enormous effort underway immediately to identify the victims. Yet DNA was not. DNA identification was certainly available and possible, but there was no very organized way to go about it. So 9/11 allowed some public money to go toward having DNA become more readily available, more quickly accomplished in labs and in crime labs in particular. So that did create a whole nother set of data points for people who were trying to match the missing and the unidentified to take advantage of.
Right, and it was Sherry Nolan, right, that kind of slipped that in. She saw the opportunity to do so, and that was a when I read that part in the book, I was impressed with that. I was reminded of how the women's suffrage vote was slipped in kind of like a Trojan horse, and it was very clever of her to do that. And you met her, right?
Yes. Sherry's a wonderful person, and it's just interesting that she was, at the time, she was working for the federal government, but in her previous part of her career, she had worked with John Walsh, who was and is a pioneer of using TV to bring public attention to cold cases. So she had worked closely with him. She remembered during the times of when he was heading up America's Most Wanted, and she worked behind the scenes. She would get letters and calls from family members who desperately wanted their loved ones' cases to become part of the show. But it wasn't the kind of criminal case. It might have been just a missing person. It's not just a missing person, but it was a missing person case that wasn't quite what was typically featured on America's Most Wanted. So what she remembered was the agony of these families, and it drove her to try to figure out if this is a national problem, and if so, could the federal government make a contribution?
Why do you think people who haven't been successful in doing this kind of thing can get so easily obsessed?
I think part of the attraction, or part of the impetus for getting involved, is that it's a mystery. I think we are all drawn to a mystery in some sense. And these cases are mysteries. Each one is its own amazing, difficult to comprehend that it even exists kind of puzzle or a challenge, or just a question of how could this have happened? How could somebody become so removed from their identity or the proof of their identity that they are just a skeleton in the woods, or a body in a river, or decomposing remains by the side of a road? And it just seems inconceivable to us in this time where our identities seem to be in much more danger of being too public rather than too private, that people could get so divorced from their identities that they end up in this terribly sad, horrible predicament. So I think that's part of the mystery that surrounds all these bodies. And as I said, they're all individual mysteries unto themselves. So I think when people come across them and they realize this, I think they're kind of drawn into wondering, and they're drawn into the challenge, and they're wondering if there's a way that they might be able to solve at least part of the mystery, which is to reunite the person with their name.
Right, and I feel like the majority of the characters, and there are a lot of characters in this book that you touch upon, but I feel like the majority of them were looking for something else when a particular case found them. Todd Matthews and Betty Dalton Brown looking for a missing brother, or because Todd Matthews married Wilbur Riddle, right? So he kind of happened to find the tent girl case. And if he, these like situations, these circumstances that come around to the right person, because a lot of people would just look at that and say, I just don't have time to do that. It's all these circumstances that you talked about before where they probably didn't have a job that they had a job that freed them up to do something like this. They had a lifestyle that for whatever reason was complementary to amateur sleuthing.
Well, sometimes that was true, but a lot of the times it actually wasn't. It wasn't really that Todd did have the bandwidth, so to speak. He didn't have the finances. He didn't have the free time, really, to do this kind of thing. But he became so obsessed. Yes, as you say, it was through his high school girlfriend, who became his wife and is still his wife. Her father, Wilbur Riddle, was the one who came across Tent Girl, who actually, he was a well driller. He was working in a rural area along a quiet country road. He was actually searching for, there were these glass pieces that used to be part of a old-fashioned telephone pole that were sometimes discarded, and it was a pretty piece of blown glass that you could sometimes find by the side of a road. So he was searching for those to add to his collection when he stumbled upon this girl who was dead and wrapped in what looked like a carnival tent. So he became synonymous in a way with Tent Girl. He was the one who found her. And as the years wore on and she was unidentified, he was actually written up in Master Detective as associated with this case. So this was Todd's introduction to this world of unidentified bodies. He heard it as a sort of a ghost story, so to speak, from his girlfriend, who later became his fiancée and his wife. And that was when he got obsessed with it. He had lost 2 siblings when they were infants, so he kind of felt an allegiance in a way with the dead. These siblings were talked about in his household as though they hadn't been dead for decades. Their birthdays were recognized and celebrated, and they were very much part of Todd's life in a way. So he felt an allegiance with this girl. And he felt very compelled to try to bring her back her identity.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's an excellent point. I actually want to take this opportunity to mention the video that's on Vimeo, which I think is like a trailer to your book. You're aware of what I'm talking about, right?
Well, I'm not quite sure of the status of it, but there was a Memphis filmmaker who had been working on a documentary about Todd's life. And I'm not sure if the documentary is completed and out there yet, but he had some of the footage is available on YouTube, and it's amazing to see some of the interviews he's done with Todd over the years.
Yeah, I just feel like it's a good opportunity to look at Todd Matthews after you're reading about him in your book, and you describe him so well, and then you watch this video of him. The accent's down. It's remarkable that someone with the resources that he may or may not have had has done what he's done.
Exactly, and Todd did move on to almost. Really remarkably become quite a high-ranking government official, so to speak, in this field. He works for the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, which is known as NamUs. And it is the first regulation government database for the missing and the unidentified. It's particularly interesting in that it is completely open to the public. It is available to law enforcement, to forensic specialists, but it is also open to the public. So if you had a missing person in your family, you could amend those details within the database yourself. So this is a truly astounding tool that is very slowly. Legislation is now in different states is now requiring law enforcement to use it. Previously, it has been mostly voluntary, but hopefully it'll get to a point where this is the national database used routinely by law enforcement, coroners, and the public for the entire country. And that alone will lead to so many more, and it is so far leading to so many more IDs. There's been a flood of IDs since NamUs has come about, whereas before it was just something, one or two would trickle in, and now it's up to, I think, hundreds. So it has made a huge difference, and hopefully will continue to make a huge difference. And Todd was one of the early people involved with NamUs, and he's still very high up in the organization.
Yeah, that's pretty cool, because what Tim and I deal with the podcasts and the cases that we're looking at, there's a lot of questioning as to whether or not it's has a positive impact on the case or a negative impact on the case. And I've had the conversation many times with listeners and with Tim about it's all in how you approach it. And if you approach it responsibly, then you're going to have positive results. Some people don't do that, but it's inspiring to look at somebody like Todd, who made something so big out of what he even called an obsession. So yes, it was an obsession, but it's all in what you do with it.
Exactly. Todd has spent so much time on this, and it's truly made a huge difference. And I think he and his family are thankfully gratified to see what he has accomplished, because early on, he, as you can imagine, it was a really questionable effort, and it might not have led anywhere at all. It might have actually wrecked his whole family life at some point. It was a real struggle when he was sticking with this, and it seemed to be going nowhere at all.
Did you find yourself emotionally connected, or anything like that to any of these cases you were looking into, or any of the unidentified remains that you researched for this book?
The one that did initially catch my attention is the one that is local to Massachusetts. The Lady of the Dunes was found in Provincetown, which is a very artsy, cute summer enclave at the very tip of Cape Cod. It's just a charming town with a spectacular national seashore. And you would not imagine that this would be the setting for a brutal murder, where this young woman was found with her hands cut off and her skull bashed in, and absolutely no indication of who might have done this to her, and is still to this day unidentified. So that case was the one that drew me in. I did spend a lot of time trying to connect with people who had tried to solve it unsuccessfully. I spent time with people who had tried to solve it without any success. I myself tried to see what it would be like to be a web sleuth and solve this case. And it turns out that I would be a very bad web sleuth. I just was blown away by how much attention to detail it would require, how much time it just wasn't something that I felt like I could even do. So it just made me admire even more the people who could spend so much time and effort on any of these cases.
Tell us more about what you've learned about the Lady of the Dunes.
I had the honor of looking over this particular case with a local web sleuth named Bobby Lingos, who was, and I think he actually might have retired recently, but for decades he was a 9/11 dispatcher. So he had the ability to go into the official system that logged the missing and the unidentified for police. It wasn't nearly as extensive and dedicated to this particular focus as NamUs, but it was the place where, at the time, it was a repository for everything that was missing or lost or stolen. And people just ended up being added to this particular database because there's nowhere else to put them. But he had the ability as sort of an adjunct member of law enforcement to log into this database. And he was one of the earliest people to say, hey, what would happen if I searched for certain criteria? For instance, there was an unidentified person with a very distinctive tattoo of initials on his shoulder. And so Bobby searched for a tattoo of that kind, and sure enough, a missing person popped up who was noted as having a similar tattoo. So Bobby was able to make these early matches because he was in a very unusual position that the public usually is not, of having access to this database. But still, it wasn't just his access, it was the notion that he could search and try to put two and two together that way. So I asked Bobby to take me behind the scenes in the Quincy, Massachusetts Police Department and let us look to see what was out there on Lady of the Dunes. So we did. We went through a few searches. We tried all sorts of tag words that we had known had popped up. For instance, her dental work had been recorded, but no dentist had ever found a match for her dental work. But we tried everything we could think of, and it came up with dead ends very, very quickly. So it was impressive to see Bobby do this and to have the ability to see how a web sleuth actually works day to day. But in the end, as I said, I would not have the immense amount of patience needed for this, and it didn't, unfortunately, lead anywhere.
I'm glad that Bobby was brought up in talking about the Lady of the Dunes, because he stood out to me as one of my favorite characters in the book as well. He seemed like a rock star.
He had an amazing number of solves under his belt.
Yeah.
He really led the way in doing this, and it's kind of remarkable that he was really just an ordinary citizen, even though he did, work as a dispatcher. In essence, he really was not a member of law enforcement. And it's pretty remarkable that it took somebody who was just a regular citizen to make these breakthroughs that, somebody else could have tried to do before him, but didn't.
Right. How many solves did he have? I can't seem to find the.
Like it was maybe a total of 6. It's a really unusual to have even one. Yet he had quite a few. He did end up retiring in a way from this kind of work. It is very taxing, as I mentioned. It's disheartening and kind of surrounding yourself with pain whenever you're looking into this. So he did eventually stop doing it. But in his most productive period, he did have an extraordinary number of matches.
It's also inspirational, yeah.
Speaking of retirement and this being kind of dark work and things like that, in writing this book, was it something that did you find yourself to become any different, like more serious or anything like that? Because speaking for myself, since we've started this podcast, I have found myself to be a little bit more serious of a person.
Yeah, so have I. And you and I, Tim, have never walked through the coroner's office or the coroner's, a coroner's warehouse in Vegas. And that I can imagine that would change you.
Well, it's funny. People have very different levels of tolerance for the field and for gore in general. I'm actually looking into the fact that Instagram actually has a number of accounts where I think it's meant for medical students to make a diagnosis, and they post the most gory, horrible stuff you can possibly imagine of severed limbs and bashed in brains and organs. And yet some of these sites have more than 1 million followers. So clearly they're not all medical students. And there's something about these kinds of images that attracts a certain kind of person. So I don't really know exactly what that's all about, but in researching this book, I did have to come up against those limits for myself and trying to figure out what my tolerance is for things that people who work in the field become inured to, but that most people don't see day to day. So yes, I did stumble upon unexpected sites within morgues, and it made me wonder, why is it that some people can do this kind of work? Of course, I do understand that some people just generate over time an ability to deal with, to divorce themselves from the idea that this is a human being on an autopsy table. But others can do it seemingly without that trial period. So I don't know the answer to that, but it does seem like it's almost like a genetic ability to deal with this kind of subject, this kind of visual, and it does make you wonder where along the spectrum you fall.
Did you find that doing this kind of thing affected other areas of your life, or annoyed some other people that some relationships that are close to you, or things like that?
I did become known in among my friends and family for this subject, and as I said, most people do consider it not a topic of cocktail party conversation to talk about decomposing bodies. So I'm afraid I did develop a bit of a reputation along these lines, but I like to think it's in service of something greater than myself, which is to raise awareness of the plight of so many people.
Right. I've had so many of those moments where people hear about the podcast and it's at some sort of party or something, or like a Christmas party or something, or a work function, and they, well, tell me about it. And then you're like, no, you don't really want to know. No, you don't want to know. And then they insist, so you start talking about it, and then they realize they don't really want to know.
Yeah.
Exactly. It seems like it always happens during a dinner party that somebody wants to know more details, and you really have to make a judgment call.
Yeah, you're either really boring because you don't go into it. You're just like, oh yeah, no, nothing, or you're this creep who looks into this stuff. Yeah, I feel like we need to have a card or something that we can just slip people and say, check this out later. Just put this in your pocket and check it out later.
One of the main quotes that Todd had in your book that he told you, which resonated to me, was towards the end of your book, but I believe it was in the beginning of your meetings and your exchanges with him. He says, "I'm not who I should be. I shouldn't be here." And I just, with all of the intricacies of all of the cases and all of the characters that you go into with your book, he is so fascinating to me. And that one line is so fascinating to me. I'm not who I should be. He had a preconceived notion just based on his surroundings and his upbringing of who he should have been. And you've probably already kind of answered that previously, but I just wanted to point it out that was a good quote by him that he gave to you.
Yes, Todd is a really wonderful, remarkable, funny, witty, and very insightful person, and he did have that insight about himself early on, that he had been led down a truly unusual path for anybody, but he felt especially for himself. He was a factory worker. I'm not sure what his sense was of where he hoped to end up in life, but he did not imagine in a million years that he would be doing what he's doing today. So it did open up an entirely new world for him. But he's the perfect person to do it because he gets it. He's incredibly compassionate, and he just has the ability now to put all of his amazing resources toward this problem of national neglect that people just don't know about.